Hello, and welcome to a special Halloween episode of A Reader's History of Science Fiction, also known as Season 2, Episode 11. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is Nick Nocturne, host of the YouTube channel Nightmind, here to discuss the new genres of unfiction and analog horror and how they apply to sci-fi. Nick, per his official bio, is a four-eyed black cat demon who escaped from his summoner and now wanders the earth, making videos about unfiction and other horror stories from around the internet. He started the Nightmind channel in 2015, talking about marble hornets, and it is still going strong today. Hello, Nick. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So I wanted to do an episode about unfiction because it's a very new and emerging genre with some significant sci-fi themes. And in the past, I've brought on scholars of science fiction to interview, but unfiction is so new that I'm not sure if anyone is studying it professionally yet. And then in my admittedly limited research, I thought your videos were by far the best analysis I've seen of it.
Thank
So,
you.
yes. So to start off, for the audience who may not be familiar, what is unfiction?
So, unfiction is argued over a lot by the people who make it as to what it actually is, and it is something that is kind of an evolving piece all the time. But basically, unfiction is storytelling online that is giving the facade of not being storytelling, that it is fiction, but in parentheses, it is not fiction. So it's a game that everybody has to sort of play into. It's kind of like an online LARP, live action role play. But there are hints here and there that it is a work of fiction and that it is something for entertainment, for mental stimulation. It is a project, it is creativity, it is art. So a great example would be if anybody remembers the campaign around the original Blair Witch Project film. That was marketed originally as a real movie in terms of documentary, that it was lost footage, that it was discovered in the woods after this group of people went into the woods looking for the Blair Witch and they disappeared, and these were all true events. And all of the promotion kind of pushed that angle. But that was not true. It was a work of fiction, it was a film, and it was all in fun. It just that it brings the universe into ours. That is basically the purpose of unfiction. It is the next level of play. Rather than just sitting down and watching the movie or watching the show, you get to engage with it in another level to certain degrees of interactivity or not.
And I did watch your What is Unfiction video where you discuss that in more detail. And I've called unfiction the found footage of the internet myself.
Yeah, I would definitely say so, because that is, well, not only is that a format that is often chosen for the storytelling in nonfiction, but by nature of how a lot of people come across it, it is a lot of finding something suddenly and realizing that it has legs, that there's an entire mass to this, even if you stepped in about halfway through the story.
Now, there are different categories of unfiction. Many unfiction projects are also called ARGs, or alternate reality games. I would say that's a subset of unfiction, would you?
Yes. So all ARGs are basically unfiction, but not all unfiction are ARGs. One of the reasons that um, myself and my peers and creators have had discussions before about, what do we even call all this stuff, and came around to the idea of let's just start calling it under an umbrella term, and how about unfiction, was because there were a lot of projects that I was covering and that were coming up in the field, and even creators themselves were making them, and everybody was saying it's another ARG, and it's like, no, it's not. It's literally not an ARG. But for lack of a better term, that's what everybody was saying. So there was a necessity in kind of clearing the air about that. An ARG, very simply, that puts it apart from unfiction, is that an alternate reality game, ARG, is something that must be played in order to have a conclusion that you understand, or to really have an experience that you can remember. For a lot of unfiction, you can sit down and watch a YouTube playlist, and from beginning to end, that's it. You were there, you experienced it, you understood the story, you understood what happened. Maybe there's supplemental material on Twitter or Instagram somewhere that gives you hints into more of an idea of what took place, but you still come away with an understanding of the story. It did not need any play on your part. Unfiction, that is an ARG, requires you to play. It requires you to get involved, to actually go through things. And at the end of the experience, it is not so simple that you can just sit down and really hit play and gain the entire idea of what happened. In order to reach an ending, the game must be played.
And the first ARG I was aware of was Perplex City, circa 2006. But apparently, you said the first one was around the release of Steven Spielberg's film AI in 2001.
That's correct. Yup. Known as the Beast, this was genuinely a beast. Oh boy, for ARGs to be birthed in such a dramatic fashion too. There was no better way to do it because it truly was huge. And nobody had ever really done it before. In fact, it's really where the terms applying to the field came from. What Steven Spielberg's film had that kind of produced this was a marketing campaign involving trailers and posters that led to media that people who were exposed to them could explore. There were phone numbers that could be called. There were websites that could be picked up. And there was an entire world, entire universe of story available there to dive into, even before you got to the theater to sit down and watch the film. And it was a crazy experiment that no one had ever really thought could be done. And as it was being created by the marketing team, they barely understood what they were doing in the first place or what they were giving birth to. But the idea of TINAG, Tinag, this is not a game, comes directly from The Beast, because that was one of the taglines in the trailers. And that kind of set the code for what Unfiction is yes, it's a game, but this is not a game. So it goes that far back to The Beast, and that kind of broke open the gate and allowed so many others to come through. Another very popular one that caught a lot of people by surprise and managed to gain a lot of headway because of what it was tied into was Halo's I Love Bees ARG, which when you think I Love Bees and Halo, what even is that? That's the fun part about it, is that so many of the entryways and storytelling projects in Unfiction and ARG seem like they're completely unaffiliated with the source media that you're kind of being led to, or that will be the end culmination as you're saying in a theater or playing a game. But that's because it offers the opportunity to explore an entire different aspect of the universe or character backstories.
And listeners who were on the internet in 2001, you may remember how innovative something like that was at the time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Now, one thing I noticed is that a lot of these early ARGs, like The Beasts and Perplex City, were corporate creations. Some were marketing for movies, some were standalone. But a lot of Unfiction today, certainly most of what you talk about, I think, is made by independent creators. So how did that change?
I believe it was just with the advent of technology on the internet becoming available to the masses. YouTube being a site where anybody could make their own videos and upload them. The availability of graphics programs, the steadily available knowledge through guides and tutorials in early days on how to use these programs that were just being handed out, and freeware especially. Whenever you give the people, just in general, people, tools, they are going to make something, and they're going to blow you away, and you're going to look at it and say, how the hell did they make that in 3 months with no money versus Pixar taking 2 years and millions of dollars? Because it's just what people are driven to do. At the core of a person is the creative drive, whether or not they realize it, is that life is creativity itself. So anytime that somebody gets their hands on some kind of tools and a spark is lit, something is going to be made, even if they're just going to mess around with it for a second. So you have a whole bunch of these crazy cool ideas, these corporate projects in ARG and unfiction storytelling, still in this nebulous area of trying to figure out what what even is this? It's marketing, but it's actually great. It's storytelling. They're going way harder. It's like a movie itself. It's like a game itself before I even get my hands on the product. And you're inspiring tons and tons of people who, once the game is over, they don't have anything else to play because it's such a small, limited field. But you've just ignited the imagination of all of these people and shown them at the same time that there is a love and a passion for this, that there is a following for it. So a lot of what happened in the early days was that, especially with the Beast, the group of players who followed the Beast and solved that game called themselves the Cloud Makers, and they came up with their own games in whatever limited capacities they could at the time with the technology that they possessed. And they shared these games among each other because they realized we have this huge community that just came together and we're all kind of friends now. And we just went through this crazy experience and we have nothing left. So what are we going to do? Just disperse and go about our days? Nah, let's tell some more stories. Let's have some more fun. And so it's really just down the line, these corporate projects and these crazy huge things that inspired people, inspiring new waves of indie creators who eventually, with the prevalence of technology that can be used to create amazing things and spread it around, it was a tipping point where a lot of corporate projects just were not being made in comparison to the people who were going out there and making them themselves.
Now, another term that you did not use in your video is analog horror, which is, as I understand, unfiction that is made to look like VHS tapes, old film reels, audio cassettes, any kind of pre-digital media.
Yeah. So a while back, and I feel like this is just going to keep happening throughout time. A while back, I kind of sat down and had conversations with my peers, and these were the same group of individuals, creators, broadcasters, reviewers, people who have been here since almost the early days of the Beast, and asked, what do we even do with analog horror? Because it is unfiction, but it's totally not. It seems almost like a cousin. Like, what the hell do we call this? Is it a branch? Is it just its own thing? And we were all a little bit confused, but one of us stepped forward and said that when you look underneath the interactivity and the idea of immersion with unfiction and playability, what you really have in unfiction is that it is uncommon fiction. It is unusual fiction. It is fiction that does not play by the rule book that was established throughout time and that most people know about. It dares to go places in its storytelling that other media does not and will not and sometimes cannot. And that really struck me and that really struck a lot of us. And we were just thinking, you know what? There's an amazing point there. Whether the interactivity or immersion is a factor, that doesn't rule out what unfiction is. So basically, we've kind of evolved and adapted to the new things that we have seen to understand a grander scale of what unfiction may be. Naturally, a lot of it is still going to involve immersion, interactivity, playability. It's going to have all of that, but there are going to be stories and projects that simply defy our notions of what came before and what we're used to, and totally defy a lot of traditional storytelling. And we've realized, okay, that's in the wheelhouse too. Basically, that is unfiction. It's harder to kind of apply what we knew about this field before and really be able to say with a straight face, what is this and how does it fit into definitions? But it's because unfiction kind of breaks definitions. It makes its own. So that's where analog horror kind of fits in.
Yes. And that's, I think, not something that's exclusive to unfiction. I mentioned in an earlier episode about 17776.
I know that one.
Of that, which is not unfiction, but still has that quality of what even is this? And there's not really a word for it other than multimedia web series.
Yeah, exactly. And I got hit up a lot over that one when that was happening. Oh man, I received so many messages, and at the time I was I was busy with something else. And I know I was
Mm.
because I kept looking at it thinking, I don't have the time to do this one, guys. And frankly, I don't know what the hell it is. But that was a funny one. And that was genuinely interesting and new and very inspired.
So, how did you get into this community of unfiction aficionados? Were you there from the beginning, or I think your bio says circa 2009?
So 2009 might have been from, well, that's either because of the age of my Twitter somehow by accident, or it might be because I was counting my first experience, which was Cloverfield. The Cloverfield ARG was my gateway. That was a fantastic game. And that really opened my eyes to this realm of storytelling and projects. After that, though, in terms of actually getting into it, studying it, making media about this stuff, it was Marble Hornets. Because at the time, I was seeing a lot on YouTube in terms of horror media and coverage, except it was all concentrated to movies, games, creepypasta. That's it. Movies, games, and creepypasta. And I just sat there thinking, how are you ignoring all of this stuff that people have made, especially stuff like Marble Hornets? These were huge, massive indie projects that just some regular guys came together and made, and it just kind of blew up incredibly.
Hmm.
So I felt like there was kind of an injustice there, that there was a correction that needed to be made, and nobody had really gone in and explored it and reviewed it and put the puzzle pieces together. And I I remember thinking at the time, well, you're the one who discovered that, so now it's up to you to do it. So I I went about it, and I sat down, and I had no idea if it was going to be successful. I had no idea if anybody was going to care, but I was passionate. I was driven, and I felt a need. And luckily, people responded to it. And they kept responding as I kept covering more stuff. And sooner or later, I realized I can keep doing this. I can cover more things. I can tell people about more crazy creative stuff out there. And it got beyond Slenderman content. It got into Wham City comedy stuff. It got into other projects that were floating around online that were mysteries that nobody had really talked about or tried to explain. And just going the way that I was going, that's how I ended up here.
And Marble Hornets, of course, was the main video series that was based on the Slender Man mythos. And I'm pretty sure it was the first video unfiction I ever heard of. And it's probably still high on the list of the most famous ones today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Out of anything that somebody's going to recognize, it would probably be Marble Hornets because that was so huge, and Slenderman was so huge that, well, it's the cream of the crop. It's the top of the roost.
Marble Hornets, of course, is more on the paranormal side, and a lot of unfiction, especially where it leans into horror, is on the paranormal side. But there's also quite a few sci-fi themed projects. Let's see, Backrooms arguably is. The Sun Vanished is sci-fi. Dad is sci-fi.
Yeah, we see a lot of sci-fi in the field and a lot of great stories out of it. Yeah, Backrooms, Dad, Kairos Alliance. I Am Sophie, I guess maybe, depending on what happened there. PB here is absolutely sci-fi. That is blazingly sci-fi. Knock plus 10 is sci-fi.
PB here, I don't think I know that one.
Oh, PB here. Oh, this room does not exist is sci-fi. There's a lot of sci-fi in unfiction, but PB here was fantastic. PB here was an animated character who appeared on TikTok, locked inside of a cell, asking for help through this app that was on this phone, and there were like almost no other apps on this phone. And so he woke up with no idea basically who he was, where he was, how he was there, and would just approach people through TikTok. And so that was very ARG because it necessitated input. And you had to kind of play to advance things and find things out and actually use that information to assist PB in his quest to get out of the facility that he was in, because it turned out that he was a clone. PB stood for perfect being. He was a science experiment. So that was very sci-fi and a very unique approach. It was thrilling to see somebody take TikTok and do it all in Blender for 3D modeling and in the fashion that it happened. That is high achievement. I'll always love PB here because it did so many unique and original things.
It's surprising how much of this happens on TikTok and Twitter because neither of those seem like very narrative forms.
And that's the brilliance of unfiction storytelling, is that we take online platforms that do not lend themselves immediately to storytelling, and then we break them so that they do. And that's what I was saying earlier, is about the whole idea of give somebody tools and watch what happens, because they'll surprise you with the availability of options that they have that the creators themselves weren't even aware were there in the first place. Because TikTok, Twitter, you're right. Those seem like, okay, it's for status updates and images and then silly things over on TikTok. How can it be storytelling? How can it be an interactive thing? But then you look at the interactive capabilities and realize the storytelling potential that does exist there. And then you just dive right in.
So, I'm talking about unfiction in a sci-fi context, and we've mentioned a lot of it is horror, especially if you move away from the ARGs. A lot of the ARGs are also horror, but the non-ARGs, I think, lean a lot toward horror. And of course, found footage films tend to lean the same way. So is that just an aspect of the format where, pretending that this is real makes it more horrifying?
I think so. I think the mystery of whether or not what you're seeing is actually happening really lends to the atmosphere. It provides an unease immediately in the viewer about what they're witnessing. Because then, if what you're seeing is real, then there's somebody who's actually in danger and it could happen to you. Because everybody knows what happens when they find out something's fake. It's, oh, it's fake. The relief washes over them and the disappointment at the same time. There's more of an emotional investment when something seems real, even when we know it's not. Because one of the points that Unfiction has had to make, especially as the internet has evolved and people have gotten better at this, and especially in doing horror, is making sure people know in some fashion it's not real. Don't call anybody.
Mhm.
Don't panic. It's not real. But at the same time, we still want the presentation of it being real. We still want to be taken along for the ride as if it was, because it just feels so much better that way. It lights up the imagination. It hits senses inside of you in terms of creativity and just empathy, I suppose, that the standard horror film cannot provide. I think that's why found footage has endured through the 90s into now, whether it's mainstream or indie or online through Unfiction. We love to see events as if they actually happened, as if they were actually recorded in something as simple as the phone in your pocket.
And with that in mind, unfiction fits so well with horror, but as you said, also has a lot of sci-fi. What influence, if any, do you think unfiction is having on sci-fi as a whole? Or is it too early to tell?
It may be too early to tell, but I can say that if you look at the unfiction that's come out in terms of sci-fi, there is so much talk of the technology of the day, emergent technology, that is actually real now. The things of fantasy before, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, all of these things now are actually coming to fruition in such a way that they become topics, they become elements of our reality. And because they're elements of reality, well, that lends itself even better to unfiction, because unfiction straddles the line between what is fake and what is real, what is imagined and what is happening. So if you have something as exciting as artificial intelligence or massive particle colliders and things that are possibly affecting our world that people and conspiracy theorists are freaking out about. Well, that is just delicious bedrock for storytelling. that is that is a nutrient-rich garden. So you can really go out there and just kind of work with it and play around with it. So I think it's the headlines feeding into unfiction. And I think the unfiction that leans into that will influence sci-fi overall. Because let's say that you're a sci-fi writer who is entertained by the series Dad, which has space travel, which has androids, which has the YouTube server being almost this omnipotent, powerful tyrant in the world. And you're thinking about that, and you're thinking about the interactivity of the project, and suddenly your gears start turning. It's like, okay, interactivity and angles where media platforms have more power than they should. Okay, what could this create then? And then suddenly your brain starts fishing, and you don't know what you'll catch. You never quite know what you're going to catch. It's a David Lynch philosophy. You don't know what fish you're going to catch. Sometimes you catch a small fish and you got to throw it back. Sometimes you catch a big fish and it comes in pieces. But I think the more that unfiction plays with sci-fi, the more sci-fi will play with unfiction.
And I think it probably goes both directions. Like there was one of them, I think it was This Room Does Not Exist, that you said feels like a Black Mirror episode.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that felt like one long Black Mirror episode. That was fantastic. And I am still waiting for a continuation. I'm not letting them off the hook because that one, just quick summary, the basic gist of it is that it is kind of I guess a VR world or an experience that is guided by AI for emotional and mental purposes. It's almost like a therapeutic thing, except it's in experimental phases and it's not going well for the person inside of it. But it has testimonials almost as if they're in therapy with the program. And actually, you know what? That brings up another one, post content. That was one in the same vein, where it was utilizing technology and bleeding edge stuff in order to run a therapeutic program to help somebody solve their mental issues by manifesting them as literal physical monsters.
Yeah, and I've seen AI therapy in mainstream sci-fi before. Frederick Pohl's Gateway, I think it was, but not so much of manifesting monsters or the system going wrong, like in This Room Does Not Exist. The more horror angle on that is not something I've really seen in mainstream sci-fi.
It might take a little while. Horror has its heydays and its downturns. I was actually discussing with my partner this year is that we seem to be going through a horror renaissance lately. Is that there's a wonderful resurgence in horror in the mainstream. It's like there's new horror movies and they're good. There are reboots and sequels and they're good. People are genuinely enjoying horror again and having fun with it. And whenever that happens, it tends to bleed into all other sorts of media, which is fantastic. Obviously, there's going to be another downturn. There's going to be a boring period, but you know, you ride the waves.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there was a trailer I saw just yesterday that is going to be probably a big sci-fi horror called Megan, M3GAN, which is being either produced or directed by James Wan, who was the original behind Saw and so many other films, and just recently did Malignant. And it's about an android girl used to be a friend model. And of course, that goes terribly wrong. So you have an immediate upcoming film that has been given the green light that's coming out in January by James Wan, where it's sci-fi meeting horror head on, perfect hand in hand. So it's already happening.
And of course, I talked about Nope 2 episodes ago from this year.
Oh, Nope was fantastic. Jordan Peele knocked that out of the park. Get Out was great. Us was an A+ until the ending. But Nope, he has never been better. Nope is the kind of film that other studios are going to try to make for years and they will never successfully replicate it. I feel that in my bones.
Now, the counterpoint to this, the interplay between sci-fi and horror is in the last interview, I talked to two Stephen King scholars, and we talked about Stephen King's influence on sci-fi, and their conclusion was more that he is a horror writer and not a sci-fi writer in the usual sense. Even when he's inspired by sci-fi and writes horror with a sci-fi backstory, his books don't wind up being part of the sci-fi canon so much. He's still writing horror stories, or better yet, he's writing Stephen King stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree to that completely. I've been a King reader for years. I definitely know a lot of King, and he certainly may flirt with science fiction aspects, but the core of his storytelling always is the horror. King never really has stories that are exploring the idea of what the sciences and technology and advancements do to us in a philosophical way, so much as they make us feel in the moment. And usually that feeling is, oh my God, run away. Probably his most sci-fi story that I can think of off the top of my head would be The Mist, because of what actually created the horror there, what created the terrors and the threats. But again, that is so much more focused on the aftermath of what was created rather than the creation itself. King stories will bring up questions naturally with their elements whenever science fiction is involved, as you expect of science fiction media. But the focus, I feel, has never been the science itself. It is definitely more the horror, it is the human experience.
And they did recommend The Mist, but they also recommended The Dead Zone.
Dead Zone, I haven't actually read.
Hmm.
It's so hard to say that you've read all of Stephen King. You will never read all of Stephen King until he's in his grave. Well, no, even then, because he's got stuff that's been trunked that nobody will ever see. And he wants it that way.
So, are there unfiction projects that you feel break that mold and go more for a straight sci-fi angle?
It's an interesting question. I would say possibly Nocturne. It's pretty actually, you know what? No, again, let's go back to PB here because there wasn't a lot of horror in there. There were so much that is a sci-fi story. I will call it there. I will say PB here is a sci-fi ARG. It has its little moments of horror, but primarily it is begging questions of the audience, especially when it comes to moral dilemmas concerning the technology present in the tale and what it has wrought. That age-old question of what happens if I give something consciousness? You know, the elements of playing God in that way, and what you do in the aftermath, the responsibility, even if you know certain things about it that don't make it quite comparable to a human life. It makes you ask questions, especially if you were there participating and helping make choices to influence the narrative and gain a certain outcome, because that is a full-fledged ARG in that the ending was created by the viewer's decision. They had to make a vote. They had to influence things all along, and their vote was very, very heavy in terms of the consequences, the morality, and the philosophical questions behind what is happening. So I would say PB here is probably our most excellent example of that I have covered anyway. This room does not exist. I would say is more on the line. I'd say that there's more sci-fi in there than horror, but most of the time, what I do cover and what I do see, even if it does have a sci-fi track to it, is more horrific. It is more relying on the human experience.
I have seen bits of unfiction like Marble Hornets here and there over the years, but I only really got into it this year, and that was through your channel. Looking back, it must have either been Backrooms or Mandela Catalog that I found first just surfing on YouTube. But since then, I've seen it quite a bit more. I know Pat from Game Theory has been getting into it. Do you feel like unfiction is going more mainstream this year or in the past couple years?
I do. I really do. And I think it's funny that analog horror has been the thing to kind of really push it forward. The ball was already rolling because of interest in big projects that were Unfiction and ARGs. And MatPat has certainly helped push that forward with coverage of certain games and certain stories. But I think it is analog horror that kind of made it explode a bit more, that capitalized on the movement going forward. If the car was already in motion, that put the pedal down harder. And it is funny because again, it's like me and my peers, we talked about it like, what actually is this? Does this fit on the shelf? Can we label it? Can we define it? What the hell is this, guys? And so we have to accept it is unfiction. It's an evolution and it's a branch of it that is sort of its own thing, but still absolutely encapsulates the spirit and falls under the same banner of, hi, I'm a random kid somewhere in the middle of a landlocked state. I got bored, but I'm talented and I made something awesome. Here you go, internet. And away it goes. I think especially what we're seeing in terms of popularity is happening. Well, the best indicator is the age of the people who are getting involved. Because Mandela Catalog was made by an 18-year-old. Backrooms was made by a 16-year-old. And that is still very hard to believe. But the crowd is getting younger. And I think wherever younger people have their focus, that is an incredibly powerful force to make something stay in the history of media, especially going forward, because they carry that with them. It's a formative experience. Sometimes people get into things and they just kind of mess around with it or they have a fleeting interest. But that kind of love and exposure growing up to different forms of media makes them more legitimate when they grow into young adulthood. For instance, video games were never supposed to get as big as they are or be taken as seriously as they are, according to a lot of people throughout the late 90s and early 2000s. And it's overtaken the movie industry in terms of revenue. TV shows and film projects are being made based off of games. It is bigger than it's ever been. And it's because an entire generation fell in love with it and carried it with them, that their passion for it never died and it never stopped. And I think that's also why we see a lot of love and growth in Unfiction, because of the interactivity, because a lot of this is play. And these are generations who learned how to play with media instead of just going outside in a field and kicking a ball. They knew that technology can be play too, that you can play a story. And this is just a new form of it, and it's growing stronger.
So, with that in mind, where do you think it's going in the future?
I think that it's going to keep doing what it's done for, well, since its inception, and taking whatever new platforms are out there that allow a little bit of wiggle room for storytelling and doing something crazy that we haven't seen and freaking people out. VR is an excellent space for it, and I want to see more done there. I've seen a little bit. I haven't talked about it yet on the channel, but I've seen some stuff, and I think that will develop. I think whatever new hit apps come up, we'll see them there. Whatever new technology comes up, we'll see it there. It's very, very hard to kind of shake the crystal ball and say, what's next when it comes to unfiction, because it is so unpredictable by nature. It is unpredictable fiction. But I think horror and sci-fi elements are always going to be here to stay. I really don't think that we'll be seeing a rom-com unfiction project or ARG anytime soon. But action is not outside the wheelhouse. Mystery is always an element of it. There's certainly a lot of stuff out there in different genres that I haven't covered, and that's because a lot of what I do is scary. Scary and spooky and mysterious, and somebody's gonna bleed or somebody's gonna die or somebody's gonna go mad. That's basically my wheelhouse. But there's tons of stuff out there in all these different genres, and it is beautiful. And I know about certain things, and again, I haven't covered them. But that's the beauty of the evolution, is that we don't know what's coming next, but we are going to see stuff that surprises us, and that is the only guarantee.
And I know that there are at least a couple projects you've criticized as being derivative, copycatting Marble Hornets, but on the whole, you're optimistic and there's a lot of great stuff still to come.
Absolutely. And the reason that I'm so hard about this with people and say inspiration over imitation and just run my mouth about it is because there's still so many beautiful original things that people can make, and they don't know they've got it inside them. You don't have to copy what somebody else did for success. You have to chase what is new, what is yours. You don't want to take somebody else's fish out of their bucket. You want to catch your own. That's your fish. And we've seen great things develop because people dare to be different, because they brought something new to the table. Yes, different is scary, but this entire field celebrates what's different. That's why things succeed here. Not because they remind us of something else, but because they brought us something new. We are the antithesis to major media. Major media loves to make copycat. They love to look at what is successful and say, well, make more of that, make it cheaper, and write me a proposal for 2 sequels after, okay, hon? We are not that. We dare to be different. We dare to bring new stuff. It's who we are at our core, and it's who we've always been, and that's how we should continue to be. You can take inspiration, but never imitate. I think creators are way too good to be imitating. They just need to actually find the courage to go ahead and make something different, even if they're afraid of the results.
Well said.
Thank you.
And finally, for someone who wants to start getting into unfiction, where would you suggest they start? What project might be a good one to start with? And if that project is not sci-fi, what would be a good sci-fi specific project?
Okay, so definitely, yeah, for sci-fi, I'm gonna pin PB here. I'm gonna go ahead and pin that to the board. Not even pin, I'll go ahead and nail it to the board. But if somebody wants something that is kind of like a ramp to more horror elements, I would watch Diminish, because that also shows the capability of storytelling, especially in the modern age on YouTube, because it combines unfiction storytelling with Let's Plays. Diminish is a game that does not exist. It's only been made for that project. And the same thing with Catastrophe Crow or Crow 64. And then from there, if you really want to see just the standard, okay, this is what happens on Nightmind a lot kind of material, watch I Am Sophie, or watch, say, Anomalies or Louise Paxton. There's a lot here, but it's very much take your pick, because a lot of these do show what this kind of thing is like and what this sort of experience is like. Some of them are just sit back and hit play and let the playlist go through, and you'll get it at the end because it's an immersive narrative rather than an interactive. But I'd say if something seems appealing, give it a shot. One of the most recent ones to kind of feel like classic stuff is 10 Tapes. That's a multi-part series. But if you want a one-shot coverage of something that has developed into a bigger project, Paranormal Paranoids. Because Paranormal Paranoids is a project that led directly to a script being written, optioned, and picked up for a film, which is going to be directed by Chris Stuckman on YouTube, who is a major film reviewer and will be getting to do Shelby Oaks, the film based off of this, as his first directorial project, which is massive.
Sounds good. And also, if you're listening to this show on the day it airs, which is Halloween morning, you should check out Nick's Halloween special tonight on the Nightmind YouTube channel. He will be showcasing video submissions from other creators, if I understand correctly. And will you be doing anything else? SCP Vault or anything, or is it just Candy Bowl?
Yep, I've got SCP Vault and Monster Hunt coming up too for this month. I've been working on the audio for that steadily. And yes, if you're listening on the blessed day, then everything should be up except for Candy Bowl, which will be up at night. Halloween night is always Candy Bowl. So SCP Vault should be there, Monster Hunt should be there, and then Candy Bowl will have all sorts of new viewer submissions. And that will be a fun time. I'm looking forward to seeing what I've got for my submissions and curating the Candy Bowl this year.
All right, Nick, thank you for coming on again, and good luck with Halloween.
Thank you.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. Most of my content is mirrored between those three, but there is some stuff that's unique to each one, so be sure to check them out. The next episode will be another catch-up episode, and I'll be coming back to superheroes with the new DC superhero movies since the start of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and happy Halloween.